All right, lesson 8. Today we're going to talk about the third and final historic period of ancient Greece, which is the Hellenistic period. So we're going to finish up yesterday's notes, and we're going to be reading today about Alexander the Great and discussing the Hellenistic period and watching a Greek cartoon. Today is pictures and captions again. We're going to talk about 4 Hellenistic events. First up is that Alexander the Great became king. His father was King Philip of Macedon, or Macedonia, which is a tiny, tiny nation just above Greece. And King Philip was a lover of all things Greek. He loved Greek philosophy and Greek culture, and he just really respected Greece. But the problem was that this is after the classical period, so Greece has really declined, and they're kind of a weak area. So King Philip had a plan to make Greece great again. He realized that the problem with Greece was that they were always fighting with each other, the city-states, and they didn't have a strong centralized government. So he decided that he was going to give them exactly what they needed, which was a strong centralized government in himself. So King Philip raised an army from Macedon, and he marched south, and one by one he conquered the Greek city-states. And he just loved Greece, so he conquered them because he wanted them to work together. And if they couldn't do it on their own, then he would be king and he would make them do it. So he also married a Greek woman, and his wife was Greek, and so their son was Alexander. For Alexander, he hired Aristotle to be his tutor. So Alexander learned all about Greek culture and Greek ideas and math and science and history from his teacher Aristotle. And from his father, King Philip, he learned about war and military strategy and tactics. And at the age of 13, he's said to have tamed an untamable horse that he rode throughout his lifetime. In his late teens, Alexander's father, King Philip, was actually assassinated. And so Alexander the Great became king, and he was quite young at the time. When he first became king, the Greek city-states rebelled against him. They thought, oh, we have a new king, and he's new, and he's young and weak, so now's a good time for us to rebel and be independent again. So Alexander rode his armies in there and shut that whole thing down. This is kind of a famous mosaic picture. Alexander the Great is on the left side, and then here on the right side we have King Darius, the king of Persia, which kind of leads us to our next one. This is the second item. Alexander the Great conquers Greece and Egypt and Persia. After marching through Greece and putting the rebellions down, he then took his army through Turkey and conquered Turkey, and then Israel and Palestine, and then Egypt, and he named himself Pharaoh of Egypt. And then he decided to do what no Greek had done so far, which was actually bring an end to the entire Persian Empire. He did it by using this fighting formation. This is called the phalanx. So he took his men and had them line up in rows, and they had their strong armor, their shields, and their helmets, and each man had a super, super long spear. And these long spears were very effective because if you were an enemy warrior and you wanted to get close enough to start killing these Greek soldiers, you're going to have to go through a really long wall of spears just to get up to the front of the line where you can start doing any damage. And if you are able to kill a soldier or two at the front, there's a bunch more soldiers behind that can just put their spears down and everyone just moves up. And it's a very, very effective fighting formation. It's called a phalanx. Here it is simulated in the computer. This is what it would have looked like. So the conquest of Alexander the Great. He marches his armies out of Greece and Macedon and goes through Turkey, the Middle East area there along the coast, down into Egypt, and then all through Persia. He really, really, really wanted to kill King Darius, the king of Persia. He chased him all over Persia for years. And then finally, one of King Darius's generals, Bessus, assassinated him. He got assassinated by one of his own generals, which actually made Alexander the Great really angry. So then Alexander the Great chased him down until he could finally kill the general. That he wanted to. If he couldn't kill the king of Persia, he would kill the man who had killed the king of Persia. So for years his army is marching around, and he's famous for having never lost a battle. Of all the battles that they fought along in this campaign, he never lost one. And they weren't all easy. There were battles where he was vastly outnumbered or he was in a bad position, but Alexander the Great was just a really great general. He had great tactics and he outfought and outthought his opponents and never lost a battle. And he built this massive empire in only about 7 years. And he got all the way to the other side of Persia, and he found that there's more land over there and more territories. India was next, and he tried to get his soldiers to march into India so he could keep fighting and keep conquering all the territory that keeps going over there to the east. And once they got to the end of Persia and were moving into India, Alexander the Great's army refused. They said, you know what, that's it. We're not going to keep going to India. We've been gone for 7 years. We're going home. We've got to go home. We've been gone for so long. And Alexander was very upset and angry, but he was determined. He would just walk his army back to Greece and Macedon, and then he would raise a new army and bring them out to India. So they turn around and they start moving back, and they're about halfway back in Persia when Alexander the Great becomes ill with a fever, and he dies. And he dies leaving no heir behind. His kids are all just super young at the time, so he has no heir to rule his empire that he's built. And so his generals ask him, Alexander, who's the next king? Who should be next in line? And he says, well, my empire shall go to the strongest. You know, basically whichever one of the generals was strong enough and smart enough to hold it all together, that's who should have it. And the generals argue and disagree and fight amongst themselves over who that is, and there's a few wars, but in the end, the generals break up his kingdom into small different pieces. So here we can see a map showing some of the different kingdoms. One general stays behind and takes Persia, one general goes back and becomes king of Greece / Macedon, and one general goes to Egypt. That's Ptolemy, and he becomes pharaoh of Egypt. And he's kind of important because later we're going to see his descendants, will be Queen Cleopatra. A lot of people think Cleopatra was this beautiful Egyptian temptress. She actually was Greek or Macedonian. She is the descendant of one of Alexander the Great's generals. She wasn't Egyptian at all. So, the fourth item is that Greek culture spread across the ancient world. Alexander the Great is called the Great because, he's famous for having never lost a battle, and he conquered so much territory, and he was a great leader, and he did it all in his 20s. He died in his early 30s. But one man's great is another man's terrible. Alexander the Great was really good at tearing things down and conquering, but he never really had a chance to have to rule his empire or to build up new institutions to replace the ones he'd torn down. So he died young, and his empire didn't last. It was broken apart almost instantly after his death. But what did last was the legacy of Greek culture across the ancient world. You can go anywhere in any of these regions and you're going to see Greek ruins. You're going to see artifacts and temples and amphitheaters built in the Greek style. And for a long time, the dominant language of all of these regions was Greek. And you can go all the way to Israel or as far out as Afghanistan, way to the side of Mesopotamia. And you're going to find Greek things. You can go to Egypt and find a major city named Alexandria that he started that's still named after him. And even the New Testament, when Jesus was born and taught in Israel under Roman rule, the New Testament is going to be written in Greek because Alexander the Great spread Greek culture to these areas. And even though his empire didn't last, the Greek culture took hold in these regions for a long time after he was gone. That is the third and final period of Greek history, the Hellenistic period.